came to the mountains to outrun memories. But the mountains had memories of their own, older and deeper than his. Elias Thorne believed that if he walked far enough, into a silence profound enough, the echoes of his own failures would finally fade. He sought a quiet so absolute it would starve the ghosts that followed him from the dust-choked alleys of faraway cities, ghosts that whispered in the monotone of after-action reports and smelled of cordite and regret. For 10 years, they had been his only constant companions. He hoped, here in the cathedral of pine and granite, to finally find an emptiness that was truly empty. His canine, Khan, moved ahead of him on the trail, a shadow of disciplined gray and black against the deep green of the undergrowth. The dog was old, a veteran like Elias, with a muzzle gone silver and eyes that held the calm, knowing patience of a creature that had seen the world and found it wanting. Khan was not a pet, he was a partner, the last remnant of a life defined by structure and purpose. He didn't trot or bound. He flowed over the terrain with an economy of motion that was both beautiful and deeply serious. He was never entirely off duty. Elias felt the familiar weight of his pack, an Eberly stock half-track that had been his second skin for years, its worn straps a constant grounding pressure on his shoulders. Inside, everything had its place. Shelter, water, food, a first aid kit. Order in the pack was a small rebellion against the chaos in his head. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked with relentless precision, measuring out the seconds of this self-imposed exile. He wore his uniform of solitude, a faded olive field jacket over a plaid flannel shirt, worn cargo pants, and leather boots that had molded to his feet through 1,000 miles of penance. At 44, he was lean and hard, a man carved down to his essential components. He moved like Khan, with a quiet that was not peaceful, but vigilant. They were looking for a place to make camp, a small, defensible clearing by a creek that Elias had marked on his topo map. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and balsam. The forest floor was a soft carpet of shed needles, muffling their progress. It was the kind of quiet he had been searching for, a thick, enveloping silence that should have been soothing. Then Khan stopped. It wasn't a sudden halt. It was a slow freezing of motion, a transition from fluid movement to absolute stillness that was more alarming than any bark. His head was up, his ears canted forward, not at the trail ahead, but angled sharply to the right, into the dense, untracked wilderness. His tail, usually held in a low, relaxed curve, was now a rigid bar. His breathing, which had been a soft pant, ceased. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Elias stopped, his hand resting instinctively on the worn handle of the folding knife clipped to his pocket. He trusted the dog's senses more than his own. His own senses were compromised, clouded by the past. Khan's were pure. The dog saw the world as it was, not as it was haunted to be. Elias scanned the dense wall of fir and hemlock. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the whisper of the wind high in the canopy and the distant murmur of the creek. But Khan remained frozen, a statue of impending consequence. A low, almost inaudible vibration started in his chest, a growl that was felt more than heard. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a sound of deep, profound unease. It was the sound a machine makes just before it breaks, a warning of internal pressures reaching an intolerable limit. "What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice a low rasp, swallowed by the trees. Khan did not look at him. His gaze was fixed, locked onto a point somewhere in the green gloom, a point that to Elias was indistinguishable from any other. The dog knew something was wrong. Something was out of place in the ancient order of the mountain. And in that moment, Elias knew his search for an empty quiet was over. Something was waiting in the woods. The next morning broke gray and damp, the sky a lid of brushed steel pressed down on the treetops. Elias had made a cold camp, foregoing a fire. The unease from the previous evening had coiled in his gut, a familiar tension that sharpened his senses. He had slept in short, fitful bursts, his hand never far from the knife, while Khan lay watchful at the mouth of the lean-to, a silent guardian against a threat only he could perceive. The dog had not truly rested. His stillness was a form of vigilance, his sleep a shallow waiting. After a breakfast of cold oats and lukewarm coffee from a thermos, Elias packed his gear with methodical precision. He had intended to push further up the valley, towards the spine of the ridge, but Khan's behavior had changed the plan. The dog's instinct was the only compass he fully trusted anymore. "All right," Elias said, cinching the last strap on his pack. "Show me." Khan, who had been watching him with intelligent, patient eyes, rose to his feet. There was no hesitation. He turned away from the faint game trail they had been following and pushed directly into the thick undergrowth, back towards the area that had so disturbed him. Elias followed, the branches of young firs whipping at his face, the damp leaves of salmonberry bushes soaking the legs of his pants. This was not a path. This was a violation of the forest's dense weave, a place where men were not meant to go. For nearly an hour they moved through the oppressive green, climbing a gentle, persistent slope. The air grew stiller, heavier. The sounds of the creek faded behind them, replaced by a profound silence that felt different from the peace he had sought. This silence had weight. It felt watchful. Elias moved with the ingrained stealth of his former life, placing his feet carefully to avoid snapping twigs, his eyes constantly scanning, his mind a cold, analytical machine cataloging the terrain. Khan stopped again, this time at the base of a small, moss-covered rock outcropping. He looked back at Elias, a clear and deliberate communication, then lowered his head. He began to sniff intently at a patch of ground covered in a thick mat of pine needles and decaying leaves. He whined, a soft, high-pitched sound of distress that was utterly out of character for the stoic animal. Then, he began to dig. His paws moved with a frantic urgency, sending dirt and forest debris flying. Elias watched, his sense of unease solidifying into a cold certainty. This was not an animal digging for a burrowing creature. This was a search. After a few moments, Khan's paws struck something with a dull, metallic scrape. He stopped, whining again, and looked up at Elias, his eyes pleading. Elias knelt, setting his pack aside. He ran his gloved hand over the spot Khan had cleared. Beneath a few inches of soil and roots, his fingers found a flat, cold surface. He used his knife to cut away the tenacious rootlets and scrape back the dirt. What he uncovered was a small, rectangular plate of stainless steel, about the size of his hand. It was weathered and stained, but the markings on it were still legible. There were not words, but a series of stamped letters and numbers. USF-LP-04-E. Below that, a smaller line. Classified asset. The plate was held in place by two large, oxidized rivets. It was attached to something much larger, a flat metal surface buried beneath the earth. Elias felt a jolt, a flicker of a memory of another place, another time, another piece of metal that marked a hidden danger. He pushed it down. That was the past. This was now. He spent the next 2 hours digging. He used the small entrenching tool from his pack, working with a patient, methodical rhythm. The ground was rocky and laced with a web of ancient roots, but he worked without stopping, driven by a need to understand the anomaly Khan had found. Slowly, painstakingly, he exposed the corner of a structure. It was made of thick steel plate, painted a dark, Forest Service green that had been almost perfectly consumed by the landscape. He uncovered a vertical wall, a heavy-duty door with a rusted wheel hatch mechanism like one on a naval vessel, and a small, thick-paned window of what looked like ballistic glass, now clouded and opaque with age. He realized what he was looking at. It was the base of a tower, but it was unlike any fire lookout he had ever seen or read about. Those were built for visibility, perched on high peaks, their structures light and open. This was a bunker, a fortress. It was designed not to see, but to hide. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, though the air was cool. He looked up. Through the dense canopy, he could just make out the tower itself, a skeleton of rusted steel lattice almost completely devoured by climbing vines and the branches of the trees that had grown up around and through it. It was a ghost in the forest, a thing of steel and secrets that had been systematically erased by time and relentless green growth. It was not on his maps. It was not on any maps. It was a place that wasn't supposed to exist. The wheel on the door was frozen with rust. Elias spent another 30 minutes working at it with a small pry bar from his pack, applying leverage with the quiet patience of a man who knew how to dismantle things. Metal groaned in protest, a sound that seemed shockingly loud in the stillness. Finally, with a shriek of tortured steel, the locking dogs disengaged. He pulled, and the heavy door swung inward into darkness, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of dust, ozone, and forgotten time. Khan, who had been sitting and watching with unnerving stillness, let out a low whimper. He would not go near the opening. Elias retrieved a headlamp from his pack and strapped it on. He took a deep breath, his heart a steady, slow drum against his ribs. He was no longer a man in exile. He was an operator again. The mission had found him. He clicked on the light, its bright white beam cutting into the absolute black. He stepped across the threshold, out of the living forest and into the dead past. The interior was a single circular room, perhaps 15 feet in diameter. The beam of his headlamp sliced through the darkness, illuminating a scene frozen in time. Against one wall was a bank of electronic equipment, a chaotic jumble of old reel-to-reel tape machines, oscilloscopes, and radio receivers with large analog dials. Wires snaked across the floor like dead vines. It was Cold War-era technology, the kind of equipment he'd only seen in museums. This was not a fire watchtower. It was a listening post. A single chair was bolted to the floor in front of the main console, a simple metal stool with a worn cushion. Beside it, a small table was also bolted down. On the table sat a metal tin of loose-leaf tobacco, a pipe with a half-smoked bowl, and a logbook. The book was bound in green canvas, the cover stamped with the same alphanumeric code as the plate outside. Elias ran a gloved finger over the console. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but underneath, the machinery seemed intact, a silent testament to a long-dead purpose. On another wall, metal shelves held neatly stacked cans of drinking water and what looked like early-generation MREs. It was a hermetically sealed world, designed for a long, lonely vigil. He picked up the logbook. The pages were brittle. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The entries were written in a neat, disciplined hand. They were mostly technical notations: atmospheric conditions, radio frequencies monitored, equipment status. The dates ran for 3 years, ending abruptly in the autumn of 1978. He flipped to the final entry. The handwriting here was different. It was hurried, agitated. The neat script had devolved into an almost illegible scrawl. October 14th, 1970. By the western wall, near the base of a conduit pipe, he saw it. A faint outline, almost invisible under the grime, of a small, square access panel. A cold resolve settled over him. This was no longer just an anomaly. It was a responsibility. The man who wrote that last entry had left a message in a bottle, and after more than 40 years, it had finally washed ashore at his feet. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he could not walk away. To do so would be to repeat the greatest failure of his life, to see a truth that required action and to choose silence. The quiet he had sought was a mirage. This place was not empty. It was full of voices, waiting to be heard. If this chapter stirred something in you, if you've ever felt the pull of a forgotten story or the weight of a silence that needs to be broken, take a moment to like and share this video. Your engagement helps us bring these stories of quiet courage to light. Subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the Lord asks us not to run from the wilderness, but to stay and listen to the truths it has kept safe for us. The drive to Stillwater Creek took 2 hours, a winding descent from the high country back into the world of pavement and power lines. Elias felt exposed, the quiet intensity of the forest replaced by the mundane noise of civilization. He had left Khan at the camp, a reluctant but necessary decision. The dog's presence in town would draw attention, and for now, Elias needed to be a ghost. He left the dog with a day's worth of food and water and a quiet command. Watch. Khan had simply looked at him, a deep and knowing gaze that said he understood the mission. Stillwater Creek was a town clinging to the edge of the wilderness, a place where logging trucks rumbled through the main street and the storefronts had a weathered, permanent look. It was the kind of town that held its secrets close. Elias parked his dusty truck in front of the county courthouse, a stolid brick building from the 1950s. He took the stainless steel data plate wrapped in an oilcloth and a high-resolution photo of the logbook entry he had taken with his phone. The county records office was in the basement, a cool, quiet space that smelled of old paper and floor wax. A woman sat behind a high wooden counter, her back to him, focused on a large bound ledger. She was tall and spare, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. When she finally turned, her eyes were the color of a winter sky, sharp and intelligent. She looked to be in her late 50s, a woman who had seen everything the county had to offer and was rarely surprised. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and direct, no nonsense. Elias placed the wrapped plate on the counter and carefully unfolded the cloth. "I'm trying to identify this. I found it on what looks like an old structure up in the National Forest, north of the basin." The woman, whose nameplate read Eleanor Vance, county clerk, picked up the plate. She didn't remark on its strangeness. She simply examined it, her fingers tracing the stamped letters. She looked at him, her gaze analytical. She took in the field jacket, the quiet intensity, the way he stood with a stillness that was not relaxed. "This isn't a Forest Service or a geological survey marker," she said, her tone flat. "And you're a long way off any designated trails up there." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "I was following my dog," Elias said, offering a partial truth. Eleanor Vance gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that were a perfectly reasonable explanation. She turned to a large wall-mounted map of the county, a mosaic of survey grids and property lines. "Show me where." Elias pointed to a section of deep green, an area marked only by contour lines and the blue thread of a river. "Roughly here, about 5 miles east of the old logging road." She stared at the spot for a long moment. "There's nothing there. Hasn't been for as long as these maps have existed. No private holdings, no government leases, just trees." She looked back at the plate in her hand, then at the photo of the logbook he offered her. She read the scrawled words, her expression unreadable. "October 78, she murmured, more to herself than to him. I was in high school. She spent the next hour pulling old survey maps and property ledgers from dusty shelves. Her movements were efficient, born of long practice. The silence in the room was broken only by the rustle of brittle paper and the soft click of a computer mouse as she cross-referenced digital archives. Elias stood by the counter, waiting. He was good at waiting. Finally, she sighed, a sound of frustrated curiosity. "Nothing," she said. "It's a complete blank. According to every official record we have, that piece of land has been untouched since the state was founded. The structure you found does not exist." She paused, tapping a long finger on the counter. "But this plate is real, and that logbook is real." She looked at him, a flicker of something new in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just a shared desire for an answer. "The official record is a dead end, but there are other kinds of records." She scribbled a name and an address on a small notepad. "Arthur Croft. He was the county surveyor for 40 years, retired now. He's a local historian. If anyone knows about something built off the books in these mountains, it's him. Tell him I sent you." Arthur Croft lived in a small, tidy house on the edge of town, the yard filled with carefully tended rose bushes. The man who answered the door was in his late 70s, with a cloud of white hair and bright, inquisitive eyes behind thick glasses. He leaned on a cane but stood straight with the lingering precision of a man who had spent his life dealing in straight lines and exact angles. Elias explained his purpose, mentioning Eleanor Vance's name. Arthur's eyes lit up. "Ah, Eleanor. Sharp as a tack, that one. If she can't find it in the books, it's not in the books. Come in, son, come in." The inside of the house was a comfortable chaos of books, maps, and geological surveys. Maps were pinned to every wall, covered in handwritten notes. Arthur led him into a study where a massive drafting table was covered with a detailed historical map of the region. Elias showed him the plate. Arthur took it, his old hands surprisingly steady. He pulled a magnifying glass from his vest pocket and peered at the markings. He was silent for a full minute, a deep hum of concentration in his chest. "Well, I'll be," he said softly, looking up at Elias, his eyes wide. "I haven't seen a designation like this in 50 years. He tapped the LP on the plate. "That doesn't stand for land parcel. It stands for listening post." He hobbled over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a worn, leather-bound binder. "These are my private notes, things that didn't quite fit the official surveys." He flipped through pages of handwritten notes and pasted in newspaper clippings. "During the height of the Cold War, from the late 50s through the 70s, the military was doing all sorts of things in these remote mountain ranges. They called it Project Skylark unofficially. It was about communications, surveillance. Most of it was focused on early warning systems for bombers coming over the pole." He found the page he was looking for. "But there were rumors," he continued, his voice dropping, "of a secondary program. A series of small, hardened observation posts deep in the wilderness. They weren't looking up at the sky. They were listening down to the ground, monitoring seismic activity, low-frequency radio transmissions. The official purpose was tracking Soviet submarine movements through geological resonance. At least, that was the story." Arthur pointed to a section of a declassified map from the 1960s. "The government used eminent domain to acquire huge tracts of land for these projects. Then, in the late 70s, almost overnight, the funding was cut. The projects were abandoned. The land was quietly transferred back to the Forest Service, but the records of what had been built there, they just vanished, wiped clean. It was a matter of national security." "This tower," Elias said, his voice quiet. It was one of them. Almost certainly, Arthur nodded. A ghost of the Cold War, meant to be forgotten. And it would have been, if not for you and your dog. He looked at Elias, his expression serious. A place like that isn't abandoned by accident. It's abandoned for a reason. And things that are deliberately forgotten are often worth remembering. Armed with this new context, Elias drove back into the mountains, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall pines. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming the outline of a secret kept for half a century. When he reached his camp, Khan was waiting, sitting exactly where he had left him, a silent, steady presence. The dog greeted him not with frantic energy, but with a quiet press of his head against Elias's hand. He returned to the tower, the air inside still and cold. He knew where to look. Following the instruction from the logbook, he went to the western wall. He ran his hand over the steel floor plates near the conduit pipe. Using the edge of his pry bar, he found the seam of the hidden panel and worked it loose. Beneath it was a small, lead-lined footlocker, its clasps green with verdigris. It was heavy. He lifted it out and set it on the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs, a slow, heavy beat. He pried open the rusted clasps. The contents were not what he expected. There were no weapons, no gold, no symbols of power. The footlocker was packed with dozens of reel-to-reel audio tapes, each one carefully labeled with a date and frequency. Beneath them were stacks of paper, detailed observation logs, weather reports, and handwritten notes that expanded on the official logbook. At the very bottom of the chest was a small, portable reel-to-reel player, a Ewer 4000 Report L, a piece of equipment renowned for its durability. Its batteries were long dead, but Elias had a portable power source in his pack, and with a few modifications to the wiring, he thought he could make it work. It took him an hour of delicate work with his multi-tool, his fingers surprisingly nimble. He spliced the wires, bypassed the corroded battery compartment, and connected the player to his power cell. He chose a tape at random, one dated from late in the tower's operational history. He threaded the thin magnetic tape through the machine's guides, his movements precise. He flipped the switch. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static. Then, a voice emerged from the small speaker, tinny and distant, a ghost in the machine. It was the voice of the Watcher, the man from the logbook. He wasn't reporting technical data. He was talking, as if to himself, or to a future he could only hope for. Another day. The sky is clear. Too clear. It feels like the world is holding its breath. The voice was calm, but threaded with a deep weariness. They tell us we're listening for submarines in the Pacific, listening for the vibrations of their engines through 1,000 miles of rock. But that's not what we're listening for. Not really. We're listening for our own mistakes. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the bunker. He loaded another tape, this one dated October 12, 1978, 2 days before the final entry in the logbook. The static hissed, and then the Watcher's voice returned, but this time it was different. It was tight, strained. In the background, Elias could hear the faint, distorted chatter of military air traffic control. "It's happening again," the voice on the tape said, trembling with suppressed emotion. "Another training exercise in the high desert corridor. 2 birds, F111S, call signs Ghost 1 and Ghost 2. They're flying too low, too fast. Pushing the envelope, they call it. I call it tempting fate." There was a long pause, filled with the crackle of the radio. "The official report will say it was pilot error. It always does. But I've been monitoring the telemetry for a year. I know there's a flaw in the terrain-following radar system. A ghost in the machine. It blacks out for a split second in these canyons. A split second is all it takes." Elias froze. F111. High Desert Corridor. The words were keys, unlocking a dark room in his own memory, a room he had kept sealed for 35 years. The voice on the tape continued, now barely a whisper. God, they're just kids. Ghost 1 is Major David Thorne. Ghost 2 is Captain Miller. They're flying into a trap and they don't even know it. David Thorne. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. It was his father's name. His father had been an F111 pilot. He had died in a training accident in October of 1978. The official story, the one that had shaped Elias's entire life, was pilot error. A moment of arrogance, a fatal miscalculation, a failure. The tape kept playing. The watcher was describing the final moments, his voice cracking. The frantic calls from the pilots, the sudden terrifying silence. And then, the new transmissions, the ones from the recovery command. The voice spoke of containing the site, of securing the telemetry, of maintaining the official narrative. It was the cold, efficient language of a cover-up. Elias leaned back against the cold steel wall, the small tape player resting in his hands. The secret in the tower was not just a piece of forgotten history. It was his history. It was the truth of his father's death. The shame he had carried for his father's failure was a lie. A carefully constructed narrative to protect a flawed weapons system and the careers of the men who approved it. He looked at the footlocker full of tapes. It was a tombstone. It was an indictment. He finally understood the watcher's last, desperate log entry. The truth needs a witness. The man in the tower had been a witness. And now, Elias was one too. The weight of that knowledge settled upon him, heavier than any pack, more binding than any order. The past was no longer behind him. It was right here, in this cold, dark room. And it was demanding a reckoning. He was still sitting there, the silence of the room a-roaring in his ears when he heard a sound from outside. It was the crunch of a boot on gravel, a sound too clean, too deliberate for a hiker. Khan, who had been lying quietly in the doorway, rose to his feet, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The dog didn't bark. He just stood, a formidable, silent warning. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright green of the forest. He was a man in his late 40s, his face smooth and unlined. He was dressed in expensive, brand-new outdoor gear, a stark contrast to Elias's own worn kit. He looked like he had just stepped out of a catalog. He held up his empty hands in a placating gesture, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "Hello there," the man said, his voice calm and pleasant. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here. I'm afraid you're trespassing on a restricted site." The man stepped into the light of the bunker. He was well-groomed, his hair perfectly parted. He had the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being in charge. His eyes, however, were cold and quick, darting around the room, taking in the open footlocker, the tape player in Elias's hand, and the resolute stillness of the man before him. "My name is Sterling," he said, extending a hand that Elias ignored. "I represent the West Pine Heritage Trust. We've been contracted by the Department of Defense to locate and decommission certain sensitive historical assets. This tower is one of them." Elias didn't move. He remained seated on the floor, the tape player held loosely in his lap. He looked at Sterling, his gaze flat and unreadable. He had met men like Sterling before, men who used polite language as a weapon, who wielded bureaucracy like a club. They were the architects of the silences he had spent his life navigating. "A historical asset," Elias repeated, his voice a low monotone. "Is that what you call it?" Sterling's smile tightened a fraction. It's a relic, Mr. He let the question hang in the air. Elias didn't answer. It's a piece of Cold War history that, for reasons of national security, needs to be properly and quietly retired. The data it contains is decontextualized, easily misinterpreted. It's our job to ensure it doesn't cause any unnecessary confusion. Confusion, Elias said. The word was flat, devoid of emotion. Exactly, Sterling said, his tone becoming slightly more forceful. You're a civilian. You can't possibly understand the complexities, the bigger picture. Whatever you think you found here, you're mistaken. This is a simple reclamation project. Elias looked from Sterling's polished face to the footlocker full of tapes. He thought of the Watcher's weary voice, of the names of the dead pilots, of his own father. He thought of a lifetime lived in the shadow of a lie. He didn't need to argue, to shout, to explain. The man in the tower had already left him the only weapon he needed. He lifted the small tape player. He rewound the tape for a few seconds, and then he pressed play. The Watcher's voice, strained and desperate, filled the small, cold room. Ghost 1 is Major David Thorne. Ghost 2 is Captain Miller. They're flying into a trap and they don't even know it. The sound hung in the air between them, an undeniable accusation. For the first time, Sterling's calm facade fractured. A flicker of raw anger, quickly suppressed, flashed in his eyes. The pleasant mask was gone, replaced by a cold, hard pragmatism. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. That is classified material. Your possession of it is a federal crime. This is a matter of national security. I suggest you turn over that locker and walk away. Continuing to interfere will have serious consequences for you. It was a threat, clean and precise. Elias felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was familiar territory. This was a language he understood. But before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation. It was not human. Khan, who had been standing rigid and silent between the two men, took one step forward. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He simply moved into the space between them, a solid wall of muscle and intent. He lowered his head, and a growl rumbled up from his chest, a sound that was not born of fear or aggression, but of absolute, chilling judgment. It was the sound of a predator that had identified a threat and was giving its final warning. The dog's lip curled back just enough to reveal the tip of a long, white canine tooth. Sterling, for all his composure, was not a fool. He instinctively took a half-step back, his eyes fixed on the dog. He was a man who dealt in threats and leverage, but this was a different kind of power. It was ancient and unambiguous. Control your animal, Sterling hissed, his polite veneer stripped away completely. He is under control, Elias said quietly. He's just made an assessment. Sterling held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills fought in the dusty air of the bunker. He was calculating, weighing his options. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. He gave a curt, angry nod. This isn't over, he said. He turned and walked out of the tower, his movements stiff with fury. Elias listened to his footsteps retreat, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent forest. He looked down at Khan. The dog's growl subsided, but he remained standing, his body a tense line, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. Elias reached out and rested his hand on the dog's powerful neck. The thick fur was warm, alive. I know, boy, Elias murmured. I know. The confrontation was over, but the war had just begun. Sterling would be back, and he would not come back alone. The sky began to curdle. The crisp blue of the morning had given way to a bruised purple gray that pressed down on the mountains, stealing the light. The wind picked up, a low moan that moved through the pines like a gathering sorrow. A storm was coming, the kind of violent, unpredictable squall that could turn the high country into a trap. Elias could smell it in the air, a scent of ozone and wet stone. It was a fitting backdrop for what he knew was coming next. He worked quickly, methodically. He packed the footlocker with the tapes and logs back into his Eberly stock, the heavy load settling onto his shoulders like the weight of the last 40 years. He left the rest of the gear in the bunker. It was unimportant. Only the truth mattered now. His plan was simple. Get to his truck, get to town, and get the tapes to Eleanor Vance. She was the only person he could trust, an anchor of integrity in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. But as he stepped out of the tower, he knew he was too late. He heard them before he saw them, the labored groan of a vehicle engine in low gear, the snap of branches, the murmur of men's voices. Sterling was back, and as Elias had predicted, he had brought force. A rugged four-wheel drive utility vehicle, a UTV, was bulling its way through the undergrowth, its roll cage scraping against low-hanging limbs. Sterling was driving. Beside him sat another man, broad-shouldered and grim-faced, with the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier. In the back were two more men, carrying heavy-duty cutting tools and pry bars. They were not here to reclaim history. They were here to demolish it. Elias faded back into the shadows beside the bunker door, Khan pressed against his leg, silent as a wraith. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, spattering against the leaves. The wind hissed through the trees. Sterling killed the engine, and the sudden silence was more menacing than the noise. "All right," Sterling's voice cut through the wind. "Let's get this done. I want the tower cut into pieces and the foundation sealed. And I want that footlocker. Cole, you're with me. You two, start on the support legs." The man named Cole, the one with the soldier's bearing, got out and stood beside Sterling. He scanned the area, his eyes missing nothing. He was younger than Elias, maybe in his early 30s, but his eyes were old. He moved with a weary competence that Elias recognized immediately. This was a man who had followed orders he didn't agree with before. He was the conflicted insider, the gear in the machine that might have a conscience. Sterling and Cole advanced on the bunker. Elias stepped out from the shadows to meet them. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood there, the heavy pack on his back, Khan at his side. He was an immovable object. "This is your last chance, Thorne," Sterling said, dropping all pretense of politeness. He knew Elias's name now. He would have run it the moment he left. "Give me the pack." "You're not getting it," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried over the rising wind. "Don't be a fool," Sterling snapped. "Do you think you can stop this? I have a legal mandate from the Department of Defense. You are a civilian interfering in a classified operation. At this point, I am authorized to use any means necessary to secure this site." The first rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, a deep, guttural growl that shook the ground. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady, chilling downpour that slicked the rocks and turned the forest floor to mud. Behind Sterling, the other two men had fired up a gas-powered cutting torch. Its roar tore through the stormy air, and a shower of orange sparks flew as they began to cut into one of the tower's rusted legs. The structure groaned, a high metallic shriek of protest. It was in that moment of chaos, the roar of the torch, the clap of thunder, the sheeting rain, that the test came. It was not a test Sterling had devised, but one laid by the mountain itself. The vibrations from the cutting torch, combined with the years of rust and decay, were too much for the old steel. A section of the upper lattice, a heavy crossbeam eaten through with corrosion, broke free. It twisted in the air, a dark, heavy pendulum of rusted metal, and fell directly towards Elias. He saw it coming, but his mind was a fraction too slow, his body locked in the standoff. He had only a split second to react, but Khan was faster. The dog didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Elias, a 75-pound projectile of muscle and fur hitting him squarely in the chest. The force of the impact knocked Elias off his feet, sending him stumbling backward, his boots sliding in the mud. He landed hard on his back, the pack absorbing most of the impact. The rusted beam crashed down exactly where he had been standing. It shattered on the rocky ground, sending shards of metal flying. But it was not a clean fall. As Khan had pushed him clear, the trailing edge of the falling beam, a jagged piece of angle iron, had whipped through the air and caught the dog high on his left hind leg. Khan let out a sharp cry of pain, a sound that cut through Elias sharper than any blade. The dog collapsed to the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, a deep, gaping gash pumping dark blood onto the muddy leaves. Elias's world narrowed to that single, terrible image. His partner, his friend, lying broken and bleeding in the mud. And the ghost whispered. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, a flashback so vivid it blotted out the storming forest. The heat, the dust, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of rotors. He was in a Blackhawk, lifting off a hot LZ. Below him, Sergeant Reyes, his comm specialist, was pinned down, his legs shattered by enemy fire. The mission parameters were clear. Extract the high-value target at all costs, no deviations. Reyes was a casualty, a cost of the mission. Elias, the team leader, had made the call. "We're leaving him." He had chosen the mission over the man. He had watched Reyes's face, a mask of betrayal and disbelief, disappear as the helicopter climbed. They found his body 2 days later. The weight of that choice had hollowed him out, had driven him into this wilderness. He had failed the most fundamental test of loyalty. He had left a brother behind. Now the test was here again, in a different form. The mission: protect the tapes, expose the truth for his father, for the other pilots. The liability: his injured partner, a dead weight that would slow him down, that could cost him everything. He could grab the pack, use the storm and the chaos as cover, and disappear into the woods. He could complete the mission. It was the logical choice, the operator's choice. Sterling saw it too. He saw the injured dog, the momentary hesitation in Elias's eyes. He saw his opportunity. "Cole, get the pack!" he yelled over the storm. Cole started forward, his expression grim, but Elias was already moving. He was not moving towards escape. He was not moving to defend the pack. He was moving towards Khan. In that instant, the choice was made. The mission did not matter. The tapes did not matter. His father's story did not matter. All that mattered was the living, breathing creature bleeding in the mud at his feet. He scrambled to Khan's side, ignoring Sterling, ignoring Cole. He ripped a field dressing from a pouch on his belt, his hands moving with a surgeon's desperate speed. "Easy, boy. I've got you. I've got you," he murmured, his voice thick. He pressed the dressing to the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Khan whimpered, his body trembling with pain and shock, but he licked Elias's hand. It was an act of absolute trust. Elias looked up, his eyes locking with Cole's. The younger man had stopped, his hand outstretched towards the pack. He saw the scene. The hardened veteran, the man they knew was a former SEAL, ignoring the fight, ignoring the mission, his entire being focused on his wounded animal. Cole saw the act of loyalty, pure and unconditional. He saw a choice he understood, a choice that resonated with a code deeper than any order from a man like Sterling. "What are you waiting for? Get it!" Sterling screamed, his face contorted with rage. Cole looked from Elias and the dog to the pack, then back to his boss. He took another step forward, as if to obey. But as he reached for the pack, his boot slipped on a muddy root. He stumbled, his arms flailing, and knocked the heavy Eberly stock pack. It wasn't a hard push, just enough to upset its balance. The pack, top-heavy with the lead-lined footlocker, tumbled over the edge of the small embankment they were on, rolling down the steep, muddy slope. It gathered speed, crashing through the undergrowth, and disappeared with a loud splash into the creek at the bottom of the ravine, which was now a churning brown torrent from the storm's runoff. "You idiot!" Sterling shrieked. At that exact moment, a brilliant red light shot into the bruised sky, cutting through the rain and gloom. A flare. It hung there for a moment, a crimson star against the dark clouds, before beginning its slow descent. Before leaving his camp that morning, Elias had taken a precaution. He had called Eleanor Vance from his satellite phone. He'd given her the map coordinates for the tower. "If you don't hear from me by 1500 hours, he had said, call the state rangers. Tell them it's an emergency." It was 1530. The sound of distant sirens, faint but unmistakable, began to drift up the valley on the wind. Sterling froze, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His private sanctioned demolition had just become a public incident, with witnesses and incoming authorities. His power, built on secrecy and bureaucratic leverage, was evaporating in the pouring rain. Elias didn't look at him. He didn't look at the flare or listen for the sirens. His world was the size of his dying friend. He carefully, gently, scooped the heavy dog into his arms. Khan groaned in pain but rested his head against Elias's chest. He had made the choice. He had stayed. He had chosen loyalty over the mission. He had lost the tapes, lost the proof. He may have lost everything. But as he held the warm, trusting weight of his partner, he felt a crack in the hollow place inside him. For the first time in 10 years, he had not run. He had not left anyone behind. And in the midst of the storm, in the heart of his failure, it felt like a victory. The morning after the storm was unnaturally calm. The sky was washed clean, a pale, fragile blue. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the trees and the distant chatter of a magpie. The forest seemed to be breathing a long, slow sigh of relief. The tower site was transformed. Yellow caution tape cordoned off the entire area, a stark artificial boundary against the organic chaos of the woods. 2 state ranger vehicles were parked where Sterling's UTV had been. A team of people in official-looking jackets, some from the Rangers, one a serious-looking woman who introduced herself as a military historian from the Department of Archives, were working methodically. They were not demolishing. They were preserving. Down in the ravine, 2 rangers and waders were carefully retrieving the contents of Elias's pack from the now receded creek. The footlocker, battered but intact, sat on the bank, a prize reclaimed. Elias sat by a small, smoky fire a short distance away, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders. Khan lay beside him, resting on a bed of pine boughs and another blanket. His injured leg was professionally splinted and bandaged. A ranger with veterinary training had arrived with the first wave, stabilizing the dog and administering painkillers. Khan was sleeping, his breathing deep and even. Elias kept a hand on his flank, the steady rise and fall a grounding rhythm. He watched as 2 rangers escorted Sterling to one of their vehicles. The man's expensive gear was ruined, caked in mud. His face was pale, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a pinched, bitter resentment. He was no longer a man of power, just a bureaucrat who had overplayed his hand. Cole, the conflicted insider, was talking quietly with the lead ranger, giving a statement. He occasionally glanced over at Elias, not with guilt, but with a look of quiet understanding. A new sound intruded on the quiet scene. the crunch of tires on the gravel of the logging road below, followed by the slam of a car door. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from the trees. It was a woman, her gait hesitant at first, then more determined as she spotted him. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, not since their mother's funeral, an event he had attended like a ghost, speaking to no one, and leaving before the reception. Their communication since had been reduced to sporadic, sterile text messages on holidays. She stopped a few feet from the fire, her expression a mixture of concern, frustration, and a deep, familiar sadness. "Eleanor Vance called me," she said, her voice strained. "She found my number as your next of kin. She said you were in some kind of trouble, that you might need a ride out of the mountains." Elias looked at his sister, at the worry etched around her eyes, a worry he had put there over years of silence and distance. He didn't have the words to explain the last 48 hours, or the last 10 years. So he chose the only words that mattered. "Khan's okay," he said, his voice rough. He gestured to the sleeping dog. "He's going to be okay." Sarah's face softened. She walked closer and knelt by the fire, looking not at him, but at the dog. She reached out a tentative hand and stroked Khan's head. "Good," she said softly. "I'm glad." They sat in silence for a long time, the unspoken years of vast space between them. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the hostile, empty silence of estrangement. It was a shared quiet, a place to begin. "The man you talked to in town," Sarah said finally. "The old surveyor, Arthur Croft. He was a friend of Dad's. He came to the house after. He never believed the official report." Elias looked up, surprised. "He never said." "He wouldn't have," Sarah said. "He's from a generation that didn't talk about things. But he never stopped looking for answers. I think you just closed a circle for a lot of people." Later that day, the military historian, Dr. Eris Thorne, a woman with kind eyes and an academic's precision, came to speak with him. She had the first of the tapes queued up on a portable digital recorder. "The voice on these tapes," she said. "We believe it belongs to a man named Sergeant Frank Miller. He was a signals intelligence specialist, officially listed as having a nervous breakdown and being discharged a month after this tower was decommissioned. He died in 1995. He never spoke of his service." She paused. "Thanks to him, and to you, the story of the F-111 Aardvark program's early flaws will be re-examined. The flight records of your father, Major David Thorne, and Captain Miller will be corrected. Their families will finally know the truth. They were not failures. They were victims of a system that valued hardware over human life." Elias simply nodded, the words settling over him, a quiet absolution. He looked down at his watch, the one that had ticked away the seconds of his exile. He saw his reflection in the crystal, the face of a man he barely recognized. But for the first time, he didn't look away. He held his own gaze until his sister came to stand beside him. "Ready to go?" she asked. He thought about the life he had fled, the empty apartment, the silent phone. Then he looked at the mountains, at the space where the tower had been, a space now filled with light. He looked at Eleanor Vance, who gave him a crisp, respectful nod from across the clearing. He looked at Cole, who was being offered a cup of coffee by a ranger, a man among brothers again. He had come here to be alone, but he had found a community of truth-tellers. "I think I'll stay," he said. "The SAR team here. They mentioned they were looking for volunteers." Sarah smiled, a genuine relieved smile that reached her eyes. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Elias. I'll come visit. We can hike."
The secret of the tower was safe now. Its story passed into the hands of those who would honor it. The injustice would be righted. The names of the dead would be cleared. Elias's part in the mission was over, but a new one was just beginning.
He had found something in these woods, far more valuable than solitude. He had found a reason to stay. Weeks later, the first snows of winter had dusted the high peaks, a clean white sheet laid over the memory of the year. Elias stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the air sharp and cold in his lungs. Beside him, Khan sat, his weight resting on his good hip. The splint was gone, replaced by a slight limp that would likely be permanent, a physical reminder of his loyalty. The dog's silver muzzle was pressed against Elias's leg, a point of constant, reassuring contact. The place where the tower had stood was now an empty clearing, already being reclaimed by the forest. The steel was gone, the concrete foundation removed. There was no plaque, no monument. The mountain itself was the only memorial required. It kept its secrets well. Elias had found a small cabin to rent on the outskirts of Stillwater Creek. He had joined the search and rescue team, his skills finding a new, honorable purpose. He spent his days in the mountains, not running from the past, but mapping the present, making the wilderness safer for others. He spoke with his sister every week. Their conversations were still stilted at times, the grammar of family a language they were both relearning, but they were talking. He looked out at the vast expanse of forest and rock, a landscape that was no longer a place of exile, but a place of peace. He had come here seeking an ending, a final, quiet fade to black. Instead, he had found a beginning. The silence he now felt was not empty. It was filled with the steady beat of his own heart, the soft breathing of his dog, and the profound, humbling quiet of a world that was vast and old, and in its own way, forgiving. Khan nudged his hand, a gentle prompt. Time to go. Time to head down the mountain, back to the warmth of the cabin, back to the life that was waiting. Elias smiled, a real smile that creased the corners of his eyes. He turned and started down the trail, his partner limping faithfully beside him. He had not outrun his ghosts. He had simply learned to live with them, and in doing so, had finally found his way home. He came to the mountains to outrun memories. He learned, instead, that some things are not meant to be outrun. They are meant to be faced. He discovered that true peace is not found in the absence of struggle, but in the heart of it. Where are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. Like and subscribe to our channel, and let this story of a quiet veteran and his faithful canine be a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not buried under the earth, but hidden within our own capacity for loyalty and courage. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, a memory that has held you in its grip, let this story be a source of strength for you. The journey of Elias Thorne reminds us that redemption is not about erasing the past, but about making a different choice in the present. It is about the quiet miracle of choosing loyalty over logic, of staying when every instinct tells you to run. God often works not in the whirlwind or the fire, but in the still, small voice that calls us to an act of faithfulness, to care for the wounded soul beside us, whether it has 2 legs or 4. The world may tell you to cut your losses, to complete the mission at all costs, but the path to peace is often found in the opposite direction. It is found in the moment you decide that a person, a principle, a promise, is more important than the outcome. That is where grace lives. That is where we find the strength to face our own ghosts, and in doing so, help to quiet the ghosts of others. May you find the courage not to run, but to stay. May you find your own tower in the wilderness. Not a place of hiding, but a place where truth is waiting to be witnessed. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. tonight and always. Share this message with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, and that the most profound missions are the ones of the heart.